The Roman Empire spread Latin around, eventually leaving, through the fall of empire in the Middle Ages, a bunch of different Romance languages. Wait, but what about here in Roman Africa? We know they wrote Latin. We know they spoke it. Where did it go? Let's take a journey. Let's dig into the rare traces of evidence of what an African Romance language could have been like before it vanished, and wonder what kind of Romance language it might have been. This is a map, the kind you've seen before in games, books, movies. It shows the Roman Empire at its greatest extent. Now let me add another layer of more recent Romance stuff. It shows Romance languages that survived into or nearly to modern times. From Portuguese to Catalan to Le Français to Siciliano to Armaniache. I could hardly fit them all. This isn't a story about them though. It's a mystery about the negative space between them. These missing areas tantalize us with their lack of a modern homegrown Romance language. Our story starts here, in the largest of these areas, North Africa, home to a prosperous civilization speaking not Latin, but Punic, a Semitic language. Punic was heard in cities like Karali, Hippo, Utica meaning old, and above all their famous capital, Karthhadasht, Carthage, the new city. But across the strait, the Roman Republic is expanding out of Latium, down Italy's boot, and across into Sicily. Rome and Carthage will fight it out in not one, but 3 Punic wars over more than 100 years. Carthage loses and is leveled. Punic will dwindle, but survive, sometimes even in official inscriptions, but written beneath Latin. Yes, you speak Latin now, and your name is Africa. So Rome divided up the land into provinces. The one around Carthage bore the name Africa. In the late days of the empire, these provinces, ranging from Morocco into Libya today, were combined into this whole diocese of Africa, one of the most prosperous parts of the empire. For all that time, the Latin here reads just like Latin. But as the empire cracks and crumbles, we start to encounter enticing fragments of linguistic evidence from this Roman Africa. The year is 430. This rich Roman diocese is facing a threat from the north. The walls of Hippo, one of its most prosperous cities, are surrounded by Gaesericus and his formidable force. These are Vandals, with a capital V, an Eastern Germanic people who made their way into Spain, struggled to fight off both Romans and Visigoths, and now turn their sights towards Africa. Inside the walls, the city of Hippo grows hungrier by the day, including one of its most distinguished residents, Augustinus. Now in his 70s, Augustine has already left a lofty literary legacy, yet at times he penned more mundane remarks, like this one about the way people around him spoke, our first hint. They can't tell a bone apart from a mouth. See, in proper Latin, one is os with a long vowel, and the other is short os. But here they'd both be os, because their, quote, ears cannot discern the shortening or lengthening of vowels. The Vandals will conquer this city. Augustine will perish in the siege, but the unclassical vowels hinted at will live on. The Vandals set up a kingdom, and for 100 years imposed their rule but not their tongue. This is a wooden tablet found south of Tebessa, Algeria. Just one of more than 40 Albertini tablets that contain Vandal legal documents, written down not in their Germanic Vandal language but entirely in Latin. At first glance, it looks mostly like good Latin, until you notice all the misspellings. Take time to analyze those mistakes, because they aren't random. The lawmakers leave off final M just about as much as they spell it. They constantly confuse the letters B and V, substituting the letter B for V over 50 times, and only using V correctly 14 times. A mistake that might be charmingly familiar to any Spanish speakers out there, but we'll come back to that. The Vandal tablets reveal something else too. Augustine reminds us that good Latin had long and short vowels, using the example of os versus os. It's true for other vowels too, like I versus E. That short I evolved in Romance languages east and west to an A sound, so a vulgar Latin pair, Pira became an Italian pera. But in all the misspellings, the Vandal tablets never do that. They consistently treat all I's the same. They eat pears, not pears. Which reminds me of another Romance language, Sardinian. On Sardinia to this day, the way they speak is so unique that it's often treated separately from the rest of Romance. While other Romance languages shuffle vowels around, Sardinian simply does not distinguish long ones from short. A pear isn't a pera, it's a pira, just as we're told happened in the early days of African Romance. We've been ignoring a big part of this story. Latin and Punic haven't been the only tongues in these North African provinces. Alongside, before, and after them, there are languages that look quite a bit different, written like this. To outsiders, this was Moorish or Berber, but it's a close-knit bunch of languages spoken by millions of Amazigh people today. Look at Amazigh words long enough, and you'll find something curious. Layers. They keep traces of words they've been in contact with throughout the centuries. Indeed, they integrate borrowed words remarkably well and remarkably fast. Some words recall the Punic days before the Romans even took Carthage. Others are more recent, from Arabic, or even very recent, from French. But among these layers are words from Latin. Tricky words. Some of them keep the shape of a proper classical nominative case us. Others perhaps resemble something out of our lost Romance language, like maybe accusative case ones without the M, just like the Vandal tablets. One author I read thinks this could explain why Amazigh has us and us side by side. It's a sliver of a fact to go on, but if true, it fits with what we see in Romance history, a tendency to take a non-nominative and make it the basic form of a noun. If African Romance emerged, it emerged in tumultuous times. Roman rule falls to the Vandals, Vandals to the Byzantines, Byzantines give way to the Umayyads, and throughout all of them, Amazigh people are playing an outsized role. Even Augustine is one, as are many of those who set out to take Hispania for the Umayyad Caliphate in the year 711. It's tempting to point to this conquest as a dividing line in history. I've seen that many times. But look through the eyes of this period, and you might just see waves of takeovers. 4 new powers in a couple centuries. But more than most conquests, this one brought a new and lasting era for the region. Not always in the way you might think. So here's a question. When the Umayyad clan from Mecca took Spain, and people arrived from Africa, what language do you think they spoke? Was it Arabic? Maybe Amazigh? Considering the histories and finds, according to this scholar, it was most likely some kind of Latin. And if their African Romance had the feature we guessed it might earlier, failing to tell B apart from V, its early arrival in Spain could explain a mismatch. The BV confusion was not absent from Spain, for whom the phrase goes vivere to live is bibere to drink, but Isidore of Sevilla testifies it's more characteristic of Africa, and yet it would become so very Spanish. So then, what if some new arrivals tipped the scales in favor of B? Or what if it's just a stretch to pin this on our unknown emerging language, and other papers warn us V changed from the north instead? Oh well, what about words? Did African Romance leave a fingerprint on the local vocabulary? Go back to Augustine, who told us how Africa avoided that os confusion. They actually used an improper word, ossum, and so did Spain. But that word was popular with the rest of Romance too. Instead, consider the Romance word for face. No, not that one. Not that one either. The one heard uniquely throughout Iberia. Rostrum meant beak in classical Latin, and rostro still does in Italian. But guess where rostro turned into a face? Hispania and Africa. For me, it's more guesswork with few answers, but I can't help follow the story to the end. Whatever African Romance may have been, it did come to an end. After it outlasted centuries of conquests, the geographer Al-Idrisi writes clearly in the 1100s about a local tongue, and gives it a name not far from what I've been calling an African Romance language. اللسان اللاتيني الأفريقي. Our final piece of evidence falls close to that late date, the grave inscriptions of Tripolitania. These epitaphs do their best to keep Latinic words alive. They do resort to ditching final M and writing B for V, like we've seen before. They also often misspell C's as K. See, C's in Romance languages changed from K to a soft sound in tse or tsi. But here in stone we read pace in vigesima, where Italian has pace in vigesima. By misspelling K and ki, these stones insist on preserving an old K sound that other Romance languages soften to ts, ch, or s. The only other exceptions I know of are the extinct Dalmatian, and again, the living Sardinian. Like so much of the evidence, it's suggestive, not definitive, but it's our last trace of African Romance. As the language fades, a Norman conquest of North Africa, led by the King of Sicily who bankrolled that geographer, brings contact with new Latinic languages from Europe, and we'll hear nothing more from this variant of Romance, perhaps on its way to becoming its own language, or languages, that maybe, just maybe, if we reach back into the past, we catch hints of its lost final M's, its B's and E's and K's and keys, its distinctive vocabulary, its affinities with Sardinian. Maybe. Thanks for adventuring back into language history and wondering with me. Gratias ago.